The Eastern teacher took a frontier job, never knowing the rancher came with it. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Nadia Osei read it 3 times standing in her kitchen in Philadelphia, still wearing her coat, because she had come home from her last day at the prep school where she had worked for 4 years, and she needed something to do with her hands before the quiet got too loud. The letter was from the Morrow Flats Unified School District in Montana, and it said, in the plain language of a small county office that did not waste words, that she had been selected as the district's new primary school teacher, and that she was expected to begin in 3 weeks. She had applied for the job on a Sunday night in January, during a snowstorm, sitting on her living room floor with a bowl of soup going cold beside her. She had been applying to things for months by then. Not because she needed to leave. She had a perfectly good apartment, a perfectly good salary, and a perfectly fine life by most reasonable standards. But the prep school had been asking her, in ways that were never direct enough to argue with, to be something smaller than herself. Quieter. Less opinionated about the curriculum. Less likely to call the department head on his mistakes in front of other staff. She had tried for a while. She was not built for it. And so the applications had started, first to schools in New Jersey and Connecticut, then to places farther away, then, on that January Sunday, to a one-room schoolhouse in a county in Montana she had to look up on a map. She had not expected to hear back. The posting had listed the position as open for 11 months. 11 months with no takers was a message of its own, and she had read it clearly. But she sent the application anyway because it cost her nothing, and because the altitude listed in the county profile, 4,200 feet above sea level, had made her feel something she could not name, something that felt like possibility. And now the letter was in her hands and the kitchen was very quiet, and the soup from the prep school farewell party was still packed in a container in her bag, and she said, out loud to nobody, "I am going to Montana." She told her mother the next morning over the phone. Her mother, whose name was Gloria, who had raised 3 children in West Philadelphia and had opinions about most things and was rarely wrong, said nothing for 5 full seconds. Then she said, "Montana." Nadia said, "Yes." Her mother said, "Is that the one with the bears?" Nadia said, "It has bears, yes." Her mother was quiet again. Then she said, "Well, you have always known your own mind. Take good boots." Nadia bought good boots. She also bought thermal underlayers, a headlamp, a first aid kit, and a large thermos that she would later describe to people as the single best decision she made that year. She packed 2 duffel bags, shipped 3 boxes ahead, and stood in her empty apartment on a Wednesday morning and looked at the walls where her pictures had been and felt not grief but a clean, sharp kind of readiness. The feeling that comes when something that has been postponed is finally, actually beginning. The train took 2 days. She spent them reading lesson plans, watching the landscape outside the window change from city to suburb to flatland, to something wider and more serious than either, a kind of country that did not apologize for its scale. By the time the mountains appeared on the horizon, she had stopped reading and was simply watching, the way you watch something you have never seen before and want to keep correctly in your memory. Morrow Flats appeared in the late afternoon. The train slowed, the station appeared, which was less a station and more a covered platform with 2 benches and a sign, and Nadia stepped off with her 2 bags and looked around. The town was small. She had known it was small. The population listed in the county data was 1,140, and she had read that number many times without it meaning very much. Now, standing on the platform in the October light, she understood it. There was a main street with a hardware store, a diner, a post office, a feed supply shop, and a church. There was a gas station at the end of the road. Beyond all of it, in every direction, was land, open and enormous and completely indifferent to her presence. A woman was waiting near the parking area holding a handwritten sign with Nadia's name spelled correctly, which she appreciated. The woman was somewhere in her 60s, with gray hair cut short, and the kind of directness in her expression that suggested she did not own a single piece of clothing bought for appearances. She said, "I am Bess. I run the post office and I also pick up newcomers because nobody else remembers to. Welcome to Morrow Flats. Do you need to eat before I take you to the cottage?" Nadia said, "Yes, please." They went to the diner. It was called Clara's, though the current owner was a man named Pete who had bought it from Clara 17 years ago and simply never changed the sign. Pete brought coffee without being asked, which Nadia decided immediately was a sign of good character, and she ordered eggs and toast and ate while Bess told her everything she needed to know about the town in the efficient, organized way of a person who has briefed many newcomers and has learned to lead with the useful information. The school had 7 students this year, ranging from age 5 to age 11. It operated Monday through Friday, 8 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. The previous teacher had left in June for personal reasons that Bess did not elaborate on, which told Nadia that the reasons were probably interesting, but that Bess had decided they were not hers to share. The schoolhouse was a 10-minute walk from the teacher's cottage. The nearest town with a grocery store was 40 miles east. Cell service worked near the water tower on Clyde Street and sometimes, on clear days, from the back porch of the diner. Nadia absorbed all of this with the focused calm she had learned to use in situations that might otherwise feel alarming. She asked practical questions. She took notes in the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She drank 2 cups of coffee and thanked Pete and followed Bess out to the truck. The teacher's cottage was a 2-room structure set back from a narrow road, surrounded by lodgepole pines that smelled in the October air like something clean and very old. The floors were wood. The kitchen was small and functional. There was a wood stove in the main room and a cord of wood stacked on the porch, left by someone who had thought ahead. The windows looked out onto the trees and through a gap in them, a stretch of mountain that turned pink in the last light. Bess showed her where the circuit breaker was, explained the water heater, told her that the landline worked reliably and that she should call the post office number if she needed anything because Bess was almost always there. Then she said, "The community will come to you slowly. Don't take it personally." They came to the last 3 teachers slowly too, and 2 of those teachers gave up before the community got there. Nadia said, "What happened to the 3rd?" Bess smiled for the first time. "She stayed 12 years, she said. Married a man named Dell who ran the feed shop. They lived 2 miles up the road." Nadia nodded. She found this information useful. After Bess left, she unpacked her bag slowly and put her things away in the drawers and hung her coat on the hook by the door and set her thermos on the kitchen counter and her books on the small shelf beside the wood stove. She made the bed with the sheets she had brought. She stood at the window for a while and looked at the mountains in the dark. The quiet here was different from city quiet, which was really just noise that had stopped temporarily. This was a quiet with depth to it, with layers, the sound of wind in pine and nothing else for miles. She was not afraid of it. That surprised her a little. She had expected to feel the absence of familiar things as a loss, the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Instead, she felt something more like relief, the particular relief of being somewhere that did not yet have any expectations of her. She slept better that night than she had slept in 2 years. She was up at 6 and had coffee made by 6:15 and was at the schoolhouse by 7, an hour before any student would arrive, because she wanted to understand the room before the room had people in it. She walked the space slowly, looking at the bookshelves and the reading corner, and the way the morning light came through the east-facing windows at an angle that would make a good spot for desk work. She arranged and rearranged things. She wrote the date on the chalkboard and then erased it because it felt presumptuous, and then wrote it again because a blank board was worse. At 8 o'clock, the door opened. The first child who walked in was a boy of 7 with dark hair and very serious eyes who stood in the doorway for a moment as if deciding whether to commit to the room, then walked to a desk in the second row and sat down without saying anything. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "Good morning. I am Ms. Osai. What is your name?" He said, "Eli." She said, "Good morning, Eli. He said, "Good morning." She had the feeling, in the way you sometimes have about certain moments only after they have already passed, that this was going to matter. She filed it away and went to open the door for the next child, who arrived running, out of breath, with a backpack that appeared to contain approximately everything she owned. The day began. Nadia Osei was in Montana, in a schoolhouse with 7 students and a chalkboard and a thermos of coffee, at the beginning of something she did not have a name for yet. She would find the name later. She would find several things later. But the beginning, the cold morning, the serious boy in the second row, the mountains out the window, that part was already hers. Cade Morrow had known his land the way some people know a language, not by studying it, but by being inside it so long that it became the way he thought. He could read the weather by the color of the ridge at sundown. He could tell by the behavior of his cattle whether the creek had run low overnight. He knew which fence line was likely to fail in a hard freeze and which post had been set wrong by his grandfather and had been wrong ever since, waiting for someone to fix it. He had not fixed it. Some things you leave because removing them would change too many other things around them. He was 36 years old. He had dark hair that needed cutting, which it usually did, and the kind of hands that accumulate small cuts and calluses the way some men accumulate business cards steadily, without much notice. He had grown up on this land and had left it once briefly for college in Missoula, and had returned when his father's health declined, and had stayed when his father passed, and had never again felt the specific pull of somewhere else. The land was enough. For a long time, it had been more than enough. It had been everything. Then his wife, Clara, not the diner Clara, a different Clara, though Morrow Flats being what it was, the coincidence caused confusion at the funeral, had died 14 months ago. Pneumonia, which still felt like an absurd reason for a woman who had been that alive to stop being alive. She had been 34. She had read 3 books a week and made the best chili in the county, and had a laugh you could hear from across a pasture. She had been the person Cade talked to about everything that mattered, which meant that after she was gone he had nobody to talk to about anything that mattered, which meant he talked about fence lines and hay prices and school schedules, and did not talk about anything else. Eli had taken it the way children take enormous things, not all at once but in pieces, quietly, in ways that only became visible when you were paying close attention. He stopped drawing during the first month. He stopped asking questions, which for Eli, who had been a child of endless questions, was the most alarming change of all. He went to school and came home and ate dinner and went to bed and did not complain and did not cry where anyone could see him, and Cade recognized this behavior because he was doing exactly the same thing. The previous teacher had been a kind woman named Patricia, who had done her best and had not known quite what to do with Eli's silence, and had handled it with extra praise and rewards, which had helped with nothing. She had left in June for her mother's health, genuinely, and the summer had stretched out, and Eli had spent most of it following Cade around the ranch with the quiet dedication of a child who had decided that staying close to the one remaining parent was the safest strategy available. The new teacher had arrived in October and Cade had heard about it from Bess, who mentioned it the way she mentioned everything, factually, without decoration, but with a precision that suggested she had already formed an opinion she was not yet sharing. "City woman," Bess said. "Boston. Seems sensible. Time will tell." Cade had nodded and gone back to thinking about his fence lines. He did not think about the new teacher again until a neighbor named Frank, who ran the adjacent cattle operation and had a gift for noticing things that were not his business, mentioned over coffee one morning that the schoolhouse water pump had been out since October. It was already the second week of November. Cade said, "Who reported it to the district?" Frank said, "Nobody. The teacher figured she'd manage." Cade looked at his coffee cup. Then he drove to his equipment barn, loaded the tools he needed, and drove to the schoolhouse, arriving at 7:20 in the morning on a Tuesday when classes had not yet started. He had knocked on the cottage door first, which was the correct thing to do, but no one had answered, which meant she was already at the school. He walked around the building, identified the pump, and was crouched beside it with his hands inside the housing when he heard the schoolhouse door open and footsteps cross the porch. He did not see her right away because he was focused on the pump. He heard her stop. He said without looking up, "Water pump." She said, "I can see that." He looked up then. She was standing on the bottom porch step with a thermos in one hand and a lesson plan folder under her arm, and she was looking at him with an expression that was neither alarmed nor particularly pleased, simply measuring, the way you look at something you have not yet decided what to do with. She was wearing a dark green coat and good boots, which he noticed because bad boots were a common mistake among newcomers, and good boots suggested she had done her research. Her hair was natural and full, and her eyes were direct in a way that made him want to choose his next words carefully. He said, "I heard it was out, thought I'd fix it." She said, "Nobody asked you to." He said, "No." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "All right," and went inside. He fixed the pump in 40 minutes. It was a valve issue, not serious, the kind of thing that happens when pipes sit through the first freeze of the season without being properly winterized. He cleaned up after himself and knocked on the schoolhouse door to let her know it was done. She opened the door and the sound of children's voices came out with her. The school day had begun. She said, "Thank you." He said, "You're welcome." She said, "Coffee." He said, "No." Then he said, "Sure." Then he stood in the doorway of a one-room schoolhouse drinking coffee he had just declined, watching 7 children work quietly at their desks while their teacher leaned against the chalkboard frame and watched him with the same measuring expression she had worn outside. Eli was in the second row. He saw his father and something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but was the territory adjacent to one, the expression of a child who is pleased but has decided not to make it obvious. Cade lifted his chin at him. Eli went back to his work. Cade finished the coffee, thanked her and left. He drove home thinking about fence lines. He did not think about her. He specifically did not think about her. He went about his day, which was full of the kind of work that fills days on a ranch in November, moving cattle, checking hay stores, running a tractor across frozen ground to deal with a section of drainage that had backed up. He did not think about the way she had looked at him with no particular effort to be impressive and no particular anxiety about what he might think. Most people he met for the first time were one or the other. She was neither. He did not go back to the schoolhouse for 12 days. In those 12 days, he heard about her twice. Once from Bess, who said she'd come into the post office for stamps and had a good handshake and asked intelligent questions about the postal forwarding situation for rural addresses. Once from Frank, who said his daughter, Lily, had come home from school talking about a geography project that involved mapping the county from memory, and that she had actually enjoyed it, which Frank considered nearly miraculous because Lily had never once voluntarily used the word geography. Cade had filed both pieces of information away without commenting on them, and had gone back to his work. Eli was talking more. This was the thing Cade noticed first and most, not the new words exactly, but the return of the questions. At dinner, Eli asked why mountains were shaped the way they were. He asked how long it took for a river to change course. He asked whether the people who first came to Montana had been scared when they saw how big everything was. Cade answered as best he could, and when he did not know the answer he said so, which was the truth, and Eli seemed satisfied with truth in a way he had not been for a while. One evening Cade asked, without making it large, "How's school?" Eli said, "Good." Then, after a pause, Ms. Osei lets us ask questions even when it's not question time. Cade said, "Is that right?" Eli said, "She says curiosity doesn't keep a schedule." Cade thought about this, then he said, "She's right." Eli went back to his dinner. Cade watched him eat and felt, for the first time in 14 months, something loosened slightly in his chest, the specific tightening that comes from watching your child grieve and being unable to do the one thing that would actually fix it. The tightening was still there, but it had given an inch. On the 12th day after fixing the pump, he drove to the schoolhouse after the school day had ended. He told himself it was about the porch step, which was broken and which he had noticed when he was there before. This was true. The porch step was broken. He brought tools. He fixed the step. It took 20 minutes. She came outside while he was finishing. She said, "You didn't have to do that either." He said, "I know." She sat on the porch railing, which was steady enough to hold her, and watched him work. She said, "You're Eli's father." He said, "Yes." She said, "He's very bright." He said, "He gets it from his mother." She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "He's been through something hard." He said, "Yes." She said, "He's finding his way back. I wanted you to know that." He looked up at her then. She was not saying it to be kind. She was saying it because it was true and because she thought he needed to hear it, which he did. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You don't need to keep fixing things to thank me." He said, "The things needed fixing." She considered this. Then she said, "Coffee." He said, "Yes." They drank coffee on the porch of the schoolhouse in the November cold, and she asked him about the ranch, and he told her plainly the things that were interesting. The way cattle moved before a storm, the particular silence of the land just before snow, the way his grandfather had built the original fence line so it followed the natural drainage, and even now, decades later, it held better than anything put in since. She listened without interrupting. She asked a question when she had one. She did not fill silences with noise, which he found, at this point in his life, to be the quality he valued most in a person. It was getting dark when he stood to leave. She walked him to where his truck was parked on the road. They stood in the cold for a moment. He said, "Eli talks about school more than he used to." She said, "He's going to be all right. It won't be fast, but he will be." He nodded. He got in the truck. He drove home. He did not think about the way the last light had looked on the pines behind her house, or the way she had spoken about Eli without pity, but with a kind of clear-eyed care that was more useful than pity. He did not think about any of that. But that night at dinner, when Eli asked whether Ms. Osa had ever seen real mountains before this year, Cade answered more questions about her than he had intended to, and Eli listened with great interest, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the first snow of December was beginning to fall. The winter in Morrow Flats was not subtle. It came on with the confidence of something that has always owned the territory, settling over the land in a series of heavy, committed snowfalls that turned the roads into narrow white channels and the fields into flat, silent plains that went on until they met the mountains. For someone who had spent her entire life in cities, where winter was an inconvenience you navigated around, it was a different education altogether. Nadia was learning it the way she learned most things, by paying close attention and refusing to be defeated by what she did not yet know. She learned the schedule of the snow, or as close to a schedule as it kept, which was imprecise but readable if you watched the sky and listened to what people said at Pete's Diner on Thursday mornings, when the ranching families came in for coffee and talked about what was coming. She learned that certain roads became unreliable in specific conditions, and that Clyde Street, despite being the main connector, was always the last to get plowed because the town's single plow truck had a political history she did not fully understand but had learned not to question. She learned that the wood stove in her cottage needed to be loaded before bed and again first thing in the morning, and that letting it die overnight meant starting the day in a cold that had a physical weight to it. She learned these things because she had to, but also because learning them meant belonging to the place in a small way, and belonging, even partially, was something she found she wanted. The school itself was going well, by any measure that mattered. 7 students ranging from 5-year-old Lucy, who was learning to read with the focused intensity of someone decoding a secret language, to 11-year-old Owen, who had the rangy, restless intelligence of a child who needed challenges to stay interested, and who Nadia was quietly and carefully keeping challenged. The others were Marcus, age 9, whose family ran the hardware store and who had a gift for arithmetic that he kept private, as though numbers were something personal. The twins Greta and Paul, age 8, who processed the world together and whose learning strategies were so intertwined that teaching one meant teaching both. 6-year-old Iris, who drew constantly in the margins of every worksheet, and Eli. Eli, who was becoming himself again. It was not dramatic. Nothing about it was dramatic, and Nadia had long since learned that the most significant recoveries usually weren't. It happened in the way that a garden wakes in spring, not in one visible moment, but in dozens of small, quiet returnings. He started asking questions at the end of November, and by December he was asking them consistently, daily, across every subject, good questions that suggested he had been thinking between sessions. He started finishing his lunch, which his father had mentioned was new. He started talking to the other students more, particularly Marcus, with whom he discovered a shared interest in building things, a discovery made when the two of them collaborated on a scale model of the county's river system for a geography project, and spent 2 afternoons arguing productively about the correct position of a tributary. Nadia watched this without drawing attention to it. She adjusted what she did in response to what he needed without ever making the adjustment visible to him, which was the only way to make it work. Children with grief in them were sensitive to being handled. The moment they felt handled, they closed. She had seen this enough times to know it absolutely. So she offered him things disguised as ordinary school activities. A research project on animal migration that let him think about journey and return. A writing assignment about a place that mattered to him, to which he wrote a precise and unsentimental paragraph about the barn on his family's ranch, every detail accurate, that she read 3 times. The community, for its part, was doing what Bess had promised it would do, coming toward her slowly. The speed of it was not personal. She understood that now in a way she had understood intellectually from the beginning but had needed time to feel. These were families who had watched teachers arrive and leave, some after months, some after a single winter, and who had developed a reasonable policy of withholding investment until the investment seemed likely to last. She could not argue with the logic. She simply had to outlast the policy. She was outlasting it by doing her job well and by not pretending to be from somewhere she wasn't. When ranching families came to the school for the first parent-teacher conferences in late November, she did not try to perform familiarity with their world. She was honest about what she didn't know and specific about what she had observed in their children, and she spoke to them as people whose opinions about their own children were relevant and informed, because those opinions were. This was apparently not always how it had been done. She could tell by the slight surprise in certain parents' expressions, the way they leaned forward instead of back, that being genuinely consulted was not something they had always walked into that room expecting. There was one difficult conference. A father named Roy, whose son Marcus sat in the 4th row and was quietly brilliant at numbers, came into the conference with the posture of a man expecting an argument. He said, before she had offered him coffee or a seat, "I heard you changed the reading curriculum." She said, "I adjusted one part of it, yes." He said, "The old way worked fine." She said, "The old way worked adequately. I think Marcus is capable of more than adequate." He looked at her. She looked at him. She had a folder on the desk with 3 weeks of Marcus's arithmetic work which she slid toward him without commentary. He opened it. He looked at the scores. He looked at the written work which was advanced for his age by 2 grade levels at minimum. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "He never showed me this." She said, "He's private about it. Some children are, but it means he needs to be challenged, and challenging him means adjusting the approach." Roy closed the folder. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and sat down. And they had the rest of the conference in the way a conference should go, which was productively and with enough honesty to be useful. 6 weeks later, Roy was the first parent to volunteer for the winter field trip she had planned to the Natural History Museum in Billings, a 4-hour drive that required 2 vehicles and a permission form that Nadia had written in language simple enough for everyone and detailed enough for anyone who had questions. He drove the second vehicle. He organized the sandwiches. He was, on the day itself, unexpectedly good with the younger children, with the patient directness of a man who was most comfortable when he had something practical to do. She noticed that about the people here. They expressed care through action. Food left on a porch, a pump fixed before being asked, wood stacked before the cold hit. She had grown up in a place where care was expressed verbally, where you said things to people and those things were the care. Here the saying and the doing were reversed, or sometimes the saying was skipped entirely and only the doing remained, and you had to learn to read it as language, which she did slowly and found she liked it. Bess was her most reliable companion in these early months. Not in a social way exactly. Bess was not a woman who did social in the informal sense, but in the way of a person who has decided you are worth watching carefully and who makes themselves available without making it obvious. She appeared at the right moments with the right information. She told Nadia about the town's history in the organized way of someone who considers context a form of courtesy. She explained which families were connected to which other families, a web that turned out to be intricate enough to require actual diagramming, which Nadia did in her notebook on a Sunday afternoon, and which helped her understand 3 dynamics in the parent community that had previously seemed random. And there was a woman named Louise who lived a mile from the cottage, and who knocked on Nadia's door one Saturday in December with a container of soup, and the stated reason that she had made too much, which was probably true, and the unstated reason that she wanted to see who this new teacher was for herself. Louise was 58 and had taught at a community college in Billings for 20 years before her husband's work brought them to Morrow Flats, and she and Nadia sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and talked about teaching and books and the particular loneliness of being a woman who thinks quickly in a room that expects you to think slowly. And by the end of it, Nadia had made a friend, which was something she had not been certain she would find here. Cade Morrow came around with the irregular consistency of someone who is not doing something, but is doing it anyway. He showed up in late November with a bag of supplies she had not asked for but that the cottage genuinely needed, a new weather strip for the front door, 2 replacement light bulbs for the fixtures above the kitchen counter, and a small jar of something he said was for the wooden windowsills before the hard freeze hit. He installed the weather strip in 15 minutes and showed her how to do the rest herself, without condescension, the way you show a competent person something they don't yet know. He came again the week before Christmas to check that the cottage's pipes were properly insulated, which was something she would not have thought to do and which, he said neutrally, the previous tenant had not done and had regretted. He worked outside while she graded papers at the kitchen table with the window cracked so the cold came in and she could hear the occasional sound of him moving around the building. When he finished, he knocked and said it was done. She made coffee. He came in. They sat at the kitchen table the way people sit when the conversation is not the main thing, but it matters anyway. She asked him how the ranch managed through the winter. He told her, in the specific and unpretentious language of someone who knows a subject from the inside, about the feeding rotations and the water management, and the way you had to think 3 months ahead about hay supply if you didn't want to be making expensive decisions in February. She listened the way she always did, fully, without performing attention, actually giving it. He noticed. He kept talking. He told her about the land in winter, how different it was from any other season, how the cold simplified everything down to what was essential and let the non-essential drop away. She said, "I think I understand that feeling." He looked at her across the table. She was looking out the window at the snow on the pines. He said, "I think you do." She brought her eyes back to him. Neither of them said anything for a moment, and the kitchen was warm and the snow was falling outside and the coffee was still hot. Then she told him about Eli. Not in a way that crossed any boundary, she was precise about that, but in the way that a teacher sometimes tells a parent something the parent needs to hear. She told him that Eli had been asking more questions, that he had made a real friend in Marcus, that he had written a paragraph about the barn that she had found extraordinary. Cade said, "He wrote about the barn." She said, "In detail, he knows it very well." Cade said, "He spent a lot of time out there with his mom when she was alive. She liked the horses." Nadia let that sit. She did not make it bigger by responding to it, because some things don't need response, they need space, and she understood the difference. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He said, "Thank you for what you're doing for him." She said, "I am just teaching him." He said, "I know what you're doing." He put on his coat and hat and left, and she watched the truck's headlights sweep across the porch and down the road until they were gone. She sat back down at the table with her grating and her cooling coffee, and outside the snow kept falling, steady and unhurried, covering everything equally. She stayed at the table for a long time after the work was done, sitting in the quiet that she had learned since coming here to hear as something other than absence. It was presence, this quiet. It was the sound of a place that was asking nothing of her tonight except that she be in it. She was, she thought, beginning to understand the language of this place. She was beginning to hear what it was saying. The snow came down for 3 days without stopping in the second week of January, and by the time it ended, Morro Flats was buried under 2 feet of new accumulation on top of what was already on the ground. The road from Nadia's cottage to the schoolhouse was passable only on foot, and on the first morning after the storm, she walked it in the gray 6 o'clock light with her headlamp on and her thermos tucked inside her coat to keep it warm, and the cold so sharp it felt like something physical pressing against her face. 7 children arrived, every single one of them. She found out later that 2 families had driven in from the outlying ranches on snowmobiles, parents dropping children at the edge of the navigable road and watching them walk the last quarter mile in a line, Eli at the front because he knew the path. She found out from Eli himself, who mentioned it without drama at the end of the day as she was bundling him into his coat. "We came on the snowmobile. Dad let me help navigate." She looked at him. He looked back at her with the self-possessed calm of a child who has done something genuinely difficult and knows it. She said, "That sounds like an adventure." He said, very seriously, "It was." That was the week things shifted in the community. Not dramatically. Morro Flats did not do dramatic shifts, but perceptibly. The storm had required everyone to make decisions about what was important enough to prioritize, and the school had been prioritized consistently by 7 different families. Nadia understood what that meant. It was not the school they were prioritizing. It was her. They had decided she was worth the snowmobile. She did not take it lightly. Roy had by this time become something close to an ally, in the measured way available to a man who had not entirely revised his initial skepticism, but had found the evidence against it to be persuasive. He was on the school board in an informal capacity, the way most things were informal in a district this small, and he began, in January, to mention her name in contexts that were useful. She heard about this from Bess, who heard about everything, and she appreciated it without mentioning it to him, because mentioning it would have made him uncomfortable, and the comfortable version of Roy was more helpful than the uncomfortable one. Louise came for dinner on a Friday in January, and they cooked together in the small kitchen, and opened a bottle of wine that Louise had brought from her last trip to Billings, and they sat for 3 hours and talked about everything. About teaching, about small communities, about loneliness and its various shapes, about what it meant to choose a life that was not the obvious one. Nadia told her about Boston, about the prep school and the years of being asked to be smaller, about the January Sunday and the soup going cold, and the Montana application sent without much hope. Louise listened without rushing her, and without offering comfort where honesty was more useful. Louise said, "Do you miss Boston?" Nadia thought about it for a real moment, the kind where you check your actual answer rather than the one that sounds right. She said, I miss certain people, not the city, not the school, not what I was turning into there. Louise said, what were you turning into? She said, someone who was very good at surviving a place that wasn't right for her. She paused. That's not the same as living. Louise looked at her over her wine glass. She said, no, it isn't. You seem like a person who knows the difference. Nadia said, I'm learning to trust it. She was. Cade came by on a Wednesday in the third week of January. It was not a day when the cottage needed anything done. He knew this and she knew this, and they both let it be what it was, which was a visit. He brought something, a casserole dish covered in foil that he set on the kitchen counter and did not explain in detail, saying only that he had made too much and it kept well and she could heat it on the stove. She thanked him and did not make it significant. He sat at the kitchen table. She made coffee. They talked for almost 2 hours. She told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her mother Gloria, about the years studying education because she had always known she would teach but had not known where or how or who. He told her about Missoula, about the year he had spent there, and how he had known by the end of it that he would come back to the land. Not out of duty exactly, out of something harder to name, a sense that his understanding of himself was tied to this specific geography in a way that wasn't negotiable. She said, I think I might understand that now. She said it looking at the window, at the snow on the pine branches, at the ridge in the distance going pink in the early dusk. He said, how long have you been here? She said 3 months. He said, 3 months is early. She said, I know. She turned and looked at him, but I'm not leaving. He looked back at her. He said, all right. That was all he said. But she had the feeling afterward of something having been settled, the way you feel after a conversation that has moved something from one category to another without either person naming the category. The next morning, she found an envelope on the porch step when she left for the school. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the county in Eli's handwriting, labeled carefully with the names of ranches and roads and the river, and marked with a small star the location of the schoolhouse. At the bottom he had written, in the concentrated print of a child who takes writing seriously, so you know where everything is. She held the map in the cold January air for a long moment before folding it carefully and putting it in her jacket pocket. She walked to school, she taught the day, she carried the map. In the afternoon, near the end of the school day, Eli looked up from his work and said, Do you have any family here, Ms. Osai? She thought about what to say. She could have said no, which was the literal truth. Instead she said, I'm building some. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went back to his work. But she saw, in the moment before he looked down, the expression that passed across his face. It was the same expression he'd had the day his father had appeared in the schoolhouse doorway with tools in his hands and coffee had been offered, and the morning had opened in a direction none of them had been planning for. A quiet, unannounced kind of gladness. The gladness of someone who has been hoping for something without admitting the hope and has just been told sideways that the hoping was not unreasonable. She understood that expression. She was wearing one herself. Later that evening, after she had heated the casserole Cade had left and eaten at the kitchen table and done her planning for the next day, she called her mother in Philadelphia. Gloria answered on the second ring, because Gloria always answered on the second ring. She said, How's Montana? Nadia said, It's cold. Her mother said, How's the school? She said, The children are remarkable, all 7 of them. Her mother said, And the town? She said, Coming around. Her mother was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet she used when she was deciding whether to ask the thing she actually wanted to ask. Then she said, And you? Nadia looked at the window. The snow outside was blue-white in the dark, the pines heavy with it, the ridge beyond them just visible against the sky. Everything was still. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. She said, Me too. I'm coming around too. Her mother said, "Good, and then eat enough, and then call me Sunday." She said, "I will." She put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table with the map Eli had drawn and traced the small star marking the schoolhouse with one finger. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows. Inside, the wood stove sent heat into every corner of the room. She was warm. She had eaten. The day had been good in the particular way of days that do not announce themselves as significant but are, when you look back later, exactly the days that changed everything. She did not know yet all the ways it would change. She did not know the specifics of what was still ahead, the things that would be difficult, and the things that would be more than she had expected in the best possible sense. She knew only that she was not going anywhere. And that, for the first time in several years, not going anywhere was not a compromise. It was a choice. The drawing appeared on a Thursday. It was an ordinary assignment. Draw your family, something Nadia had given to all 7 students as part of a unit on community and belonging, a gentle and open-ended prompt that was meant to tell her less about their drawing ability and more about what the word family meant to each of them. Most of the children had drawn what you would expect: house shapes, smiling stick figures, pets included with the same weight as siblings. Lucy drew herself, her parents, her grandmother, and their dog in a line from tallest to shortest. Owen drew a dinner table scene from above. Greta and Paul, almost inevitably, drew each other. Eli's paper was on her desk at the end of the day. He had been the last to hand it in, sliding it onto the pile without looking at her, which she had noticed but not pursued. She did not see it until the other children had gone. She was alone in the schoolhouse, straightening the book corner, when she came back to her desk and picked up the stack of drawings to file. She went through them one at a time. She came to Eli's and she stopped. He had drawn 2 figures standing outside a building. The building was clearly the schoolhouse. He had drawn the porch step, the exact angle of the roof, the way the east-facing windows caught the light. The 2 figures were standing close together, not touching. One was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what was identifiably a ranch coat and work boots. The other was shorter, with a full halo of dark hair, holding what could only be a thermos. He had written beneath them, in his careful, concentrated print, "Dad and Ms. Osai." There was no third figure, no other person. His mother, who had appeared in every drawing he had made in the months Nadia knew him, in the background, in the margins, sometimes as just a hand reaching into the frame, was not in this one. This was the first time, in 14 months, that Eli had made something without her in it. Nadia stood at her desk in the empty schoolhouse with the drawing in both hands and the January cold coming in under the door, and she did not move for a long time. She was not sure at first what she was feeling. It was not a simple thing. There was something that moved her deeply about the absence, about what it meant for a grieving child to begin, quietly and on his own terms, to make space in his picture of the world. Not to replace, not to forget, simply to make space, the way you eventually open a window in a room that has been closed too long. There was also something that moved her differently about the presence, about being drawn into a child's picture of his family, about being placed, in a 7-year-old's clear-eyed and unpretentious assessment of the world, beside his father. She folded the drawing with care and placed it in the attendance file, which was where she kept the things that mattered most, and she did not look at it again for 3 days. When she did look at it again, it was a Sunday evening. She had spent the day planning the following week's lessons and had allowed herself, at the end of it, to sit by the wood stove with a book she was not really reading. The folder was on the table from some other administrative work she had done that afternoon, and she opened it without fully deciding to, and the drawing was there. She sat with it for a long time. The fire in the wood stove ticked and settled. Outside, the wind was moving the pines. She pressed her knuckles briefly against her mouth, which was the thing she did when something arrived in her chest that was too large to process quickly. Then she sat back and simply looked at what Eli had made. She called her mother that night. Gloria answered and said, "You sound different." Nadia said, "I am different, I think." Her mother said, "Different how?" Nadia sat with the question for a moment and then said, "Like something has been figured out. Not by me, I didn't figure it out. Something just settled." Her mother said, "Is this about that rancher?" Nadia said, "This is about a 7-year-old boy who drew a picture." Gloria was quiet, then she said, "I see." Nadia said, "It's about the drawing." Her mother said, "I hear you." Nadia said, "Mom." Her mother said, "I am being very quiet and listening to every word you say." Nadia laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that breaks through when something you've been holding loosens. She said, "I am not in love with Cade Morrow." Her mother said, "I did not say anything." Nadia said, "I know what you're thinking." Her mother said, "I am thinking that Montana sounds like it is treating my daughter well, and I am very glad I told her to take good boots." They talked for an hour. She told her mother about the drawing, about Eli, about what the drawing meant and what she thought it might mean and what she refused to make it mean before it was ready to mean it. Her mother listened with the quality of attention that Nadia had grown up understanding as the highest form of respect, total, patient, free of agenda. At the end, Gloria said, "Sounds like you belong there." Nadia said, "I don't know what I belong to." Her mother said without hesitation, "Yes, you do." Cade arrived at the schoolhouse on a Monday morning before classes began, which was not unusual by January, but his face when she opened the door was carrying something that was not his usual expression, which was neutral in the way of a person who has learned to keep what matters close. He said, "I need to tell you something." She stepped back and let him in. He came inside and stood in the middle of the classroom with the morning light coming through the east windows and said, "Eli asked me at breakfast this morning if you were going to leave." She looked at him. He said, "I didn't know what to tell him, so I told him I didn't know." She said, "What made him ask?" He said, "I don't know. He has been worried about it for a while, I think. He didn't say it before." She understood. Children with grief in them were afraid of disappearance. They became attuned to it the way people become attuned to anything they have lost, sensitized, alert to the first signals of another leaving. Eli had been watching her for months, adding up the evidence, and something had made him name the fear out loud. She knew what that something was. It was the drawing. Drawing her in had made the fear real enough to speak. She said, "Eli is not someone I would leave without telling." She paused. "I am reapplying for the position in October. I haven't told anyone yet." Cade looked at her. He said, "You haven't told the district office." She said, "I sent the intention letter last week. I wanted to make sure it was real before I said it." He said, "And it's real." She said, "It's real." He stood in the middle of her classroom with his hat in his hands and the morning light on him, and she could see him processing the information with the careful and unhurried quality that she had come to recognize as simply how he processed things that mattered. He was not a fast man with important things. He was thorough. He said finally, "I'm glad." She said, "I know." He looked at her then directly, the way he did when he was not managing anything, just being where he was. She looked back. The classroom around them was quiet, the books on the shelves and the drawings on the wall and the chalkboard with tomorrow's lesson still half written. Outside, the winter light was making everything clean. He said, "Tell Eli yourself. He'll need to hear it from you." She said, "I will." He put his hat back on and left. She watched the door close behind him and stood for a moment in the middle of her classroom, in the particular stillness that follows something that has been said at last, and then she went to the chalkboard and finished writing tomorrow's lesson. When Eli arrived at 8 o'clock and sat in the second row with his serious eyes and his backpack full of the organized materials of a child who is precise about such things, she waited until the other students had settled into the morning reading, and then she walked to his desk and crouched beside it. She said quietly, "Your father told me what you asked him." Eli looked at her. He did not look away. She said, "I am not leaving. Not for a long time, I want you to know that. He said, how long? She said, I don't know exactly. Long enough to see you finish school here. Long enough to see what you become. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, with the directness of a child who says what he means, I want you to stay. She said, I know, I want to stay too. He nodded once, the way his father nodded when something was settled. Then he went back to his reading. She stood and walked back to the front of the classroom. She picked up the chalk. The day went on. Outside, the winter held the land in its long, heavy grip. Inside, the schoolhouse was warm and the 7 children were reading, and the chalkboard was filling with the things they would all need to know, and Nadia Osei was exactly where she had decided she was going to be. Nothing about the decision was dramatic. It was simply made. That was enough. There is a particular quality to spring in Montana that a person who has only known city springs cannot anticipate. It is not gentle. It does not arrive as a brightening and a warming, as a civil transition from one season to the next. It arrives as an argument. The snow recedes unevenly, leaving the land patchy and raw and brown-gray in the places that have been covered for months, and the mud comes in quantities and a consistency that must be seen to be believed. And the creek behind the teacher's cottage, which had been frozen and silent since November, suddenly begins running again with such urgent noise that Nadia woke the first morning she heard it and lay still in the dark, trying to understand what had changed. Then she understood. She put her hands behind her head and listened to the water moving in the dark. She smiled. March was difficult and April was better, and by May the fields were green enough to be green, not just thawing. And the light lasted until 8 in the evening, and the air had lost the specific quality that cold air has, that compressed and dangerous quality, and become something easier and more willing. Nadia began taking her planning work outside in the afternoons after the school day ended, sitting on the repaired porch step with her notebook and her thermos. And the sound of the land in May was entirely different from anything she had heard here before. Birds she didn't know yet, the creek, wind through the new leaves on the aspens at the edge of the property, cattle in a distant field. She was learning all of it. She was still in the middle of learning it, which she understood now was simply how it would always be, and she did not mind. A place this size and this particular had more to teach than a person could absorb in 1 year or probably in 10, and the understanding of this was not discouraging, but the opposite. It meant the place would keep being interesting. It meant she would keep having reasons to pay attention. The school year was drawing toward its end. In a classroom with only 7 students, the ending of a year has a different weight than it does in a large school. There is no anonymity. Each child's growth is known precisely, is something Nadia had watched from the inside, and the transitions, Lucy reading independently now, Owen accelerating past anything the district materials could offer him, Marcus finally showing his work openly instead of hiding his reasoning as if math were something to be embarrassed by. Each one belonged to her, and to the student both, in the way that learning belongs to teacher and student when both have been paying full attention. Eli had moved, not in ways that were visible from a distance, but in every way that mattered up close. He was a child again, or rather he was a child once more in the full sense, curious and argumentative when he disagreed with something, and capable of laughing at the things that were funny without that specific hesitation he had carried in the fall, the hesitation that came from not being sure laughter was allowed. He asked questions constantly. He had read 12 library books since February that were not assigned, which she knew because he returned them to her personally rather than to the basket, so she would know he had read them. He had developed opinions about geology and about the history of the railroads in the American West, and about which card games were unfairly maligned, opinions he expressed without apology. She had watched him become this, and it was, without qualification, the best thing she had done in this first year. Not the only thing, but the best. In June, the county school board held its annual meeting, which in Morrow Flats was attended by most of the community, because in a town of 1,140 people, a school board meeting was also, functionally, a community gathering. Nadia sat at the front table with the board members and the district administrator and presented her year-end summary, which she had prepared with the same care she gave to everything, specific, honest, data-supported, and shaped to convey not just what had happened but why it mattered. She was not nervous. She had been in many rooms that expected her to be smaller than she was. This room was not one of them, and she knew it, and she did not shrink. Roy, who was on the board in his informal capacity, asked 2 direct and intelligent questions and seemed satisfied with the answers. Bess, who had no official role but was present as she was present at everything that mattered in this town, sat in the second row and watched with the expression she wore when she was forming a final opinion. Louise was in the back with her husband and smiled when Nadia caught her eye. Cade sat in the third row on the right side, which she had noticed when she came in and had not looked at again since, because looking at him during a professional presentation would have caused her to think about things that were not relevant to the presentation, which was not useful. But she knew he was there the way you know when a specific thing is in a room without looking at it, a particular awareness that locates itself in the body rather than in the eyes. The board approved the year-end report and confirmed her contract for the following year. There was a brief and genuine round of applause from the assembled community, the kind that is not performative but simply expressive, and Nadia thanked them without false modesty and without deflection, because she had learned here that honest acknowledgement was more respectful than false humility. Afterward, in the parking area outside, people came and talked to her. Frank shook her hand with conviction. Louise hugged her. Roy told her, gruffly and briefly, that Marcus had told him he wanted to be an engineer, which he had never said before, and that Roy thought she deserved to know that. She told him Marcus would be excellent at it. Roy agreed and walked to his truck. Cade found her near the edge of the parking area, which had emptied by this point to a few remaining trucks, and the long Montana evening stretched over everything, the light so prolonged at this time of year that it felt indulgent. He said, "Good meeting." She said, "Thank you for coming." He said, "I wanted to hear you talk about the year." She looked at him, she said, "And?" He said, "And I've been watching what you've done for this town for 8 months. He paused. "I don't think you know all of it yet, what you've done." She said, "I know some of it." He said, "Eli showed me the map he made you, in January." She said, "I still have it." He said, "I know, he told me." She looked at him across the quiet evening parking area, and there was between them the specific comfortable weight of people who have been honest with each other gradually, and are now standing in the accumulated result of all those small honestnesses. She had not rushed anything. Neither had he. They had both been, for the past 8 months, simply present in each other's proximity and paying attention, and what had built up as a result of that was not dramatic but was real, which she had learned here was the more durable kind. She said, "I called my mother after I got the contract renewal." He said, "What did she say?" She said I had finally stopped running from myself. I told her I was never running. She said she knew the difference and I didn't. He said, "Is she right?" Nadia considered this seriously because she considered most things seriously. Then she said, "Probably." He said, with the quiet humor that was available to him, but that he extended only selectively, "Your mother and Bess would get along." She said, "That is a frightening thought." He smiled. It was a real smile, not the small, careful version. She had seen the real version only a few times before, and each time it had done something to the quality of the air around him, as if something had been let out. She said, "Eli starts 2nd grade in the fall." He said, "I know." She said, "He told me last week that he wants to read every book on the science shelf before summer." Cade said, "He told me the same thing. I told him that was a lot of books. He said Ms. Osei reads faster than any person in Montana. She said it was probably fine. She laughed. He looked at her when she laughed, with the expression of a man who finds that a particular sound does something specific to his understanding of the world, and is not sure yet what to do with this information. She said, "Tell him I'll race him." He said, "He will take that very seriously." She said, "I know, so will I." They stood in the evening light for a moment more. The last trucks were pulling out of the parking area. The mountains to the west were going from gold to rose to something deeper. Somewhere across the pastures, cattle were moving in the slow and settled way of animals that know where they are going. She said, "I should get home." He said, "I'll walk you." She did not argue with this. They walked from the parking area down the road toward the cottage, a distance of half a mile, in the slow and comfortable way of people who are not in a hurry to be done with each other's company. The evening was warm enough to be pleasant and cool enough to be clear, and the light was doing what it does in Montana in June, which is to say it was doing something that a person from the city has to see many times before they stop being surprised by it. She said partway along, "I want to start a small lending library in the school, a take-a-book-leave-a book arrangement. I'm going to ask the community for donations in the fall." He said, "I'll bring books." She said, "You have books." He said Clara had books, more than I know what to do with. He paused. Eli has read the ones for children, the rest have been sitting. She said I would like them for the school. He said they should be used. They walked in silence for a moment. She said without making it large, "That's a generous thing." He said, "They're books." The generous thing was her for reading all of them. She looked at him sideways. He was looking ahead at the road, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression the neutral one that was not really neutral once you knew him well enough to read it. She knew him well enough now. They reached the cottage. She stopped at the gate. He stopped beside her. She said, "Thank you for walking me." He said, "Any time." She said, "That's a large offer." He said, "I know." She looked at him in the last long light of the Montana evening. He looked back. There was no requirement between them at this moment for anything to be decided or declared or moved toward. They had both been through enough to know that the right things, when they were genuinely right, did not need to be forced into a shape before they were ready. They could be allowed to be what they were, which was present and clear, and on this particular evening, enough. She said, "Good night, Cade." He said, "Good night, Nadia." She opened the gate and walked up to the porch and opened the cottage door. She stood in the doorway for a moment, which was warm behind her and cool in front of her, the line between inside and outside drawn exactly at the threshold. She was not the person who had stepped off a train in October with 2 bags and a thermos and the stubborn intention of finding out if she could belong somewhere. She was still herself, the same opinionated, precise, clear-eyed woman who had sent an application on a Sunday night without expecting much. But she was herself here now, in this place, with these people, in this light. The belonging she had been working toward all year was not a thing she had arrived at. It was a thing she had built, steadily, in the way that anything real is built, slowly, with attention, in the daily practice of showing up and doing the work with her full self, not a managed or reduced version of it. She thought of Eli's drawing, which was still in the attendance file where she had placed it in January. 2 figures outside the schoolhouse, Dad and Ms. Osei. No caption required, no explanation necessary. She thought of the map with the small star marking the schoolhouse, so you know where everything is. She knew where everything was. She turned on the light in the cottage and closed the door behind her and started the kettle for tea and took her planning notebook from her bag, because there were lessons still to prepare for the last weeks of the school year, and she was someone who prepared her lessons thoroughly and did not leave them for the morning. The water in the creek behind the cottage ran in the dark, unhurried and certain, the way water runs when it has found the right course after a long winter of waiting. She worked until 10 and went asleep. In the fall she reapplied, The district confirmed her without delay. Eli started second grade. The lending library was built from 3 wooden crates by Roy, who did not announce he was doing it, but simply appeared one Saturday with wood and tools, and a look that dared anyone to make something of it. Clara's books arrived in 2 boxes and went onto the shelves and were taken down and read and returned and taken down again. The year turned. The land held. The school was warm and the work was real and the people in it, all 7 of the small ones and the larger ones who moved through the days around them, were, each in their own way, exactly where they needed to be. There was no single moment that could be pointed to, no single day on which everything changed. It had changed the way that places change you when you let them, not suddenly, but completely, in ways you only fully see when you look back from somewhere further on. She had come for a job. She had not known, when she arrived, that the job would come with a land that needed learning, and a community that needed patience, and a boy who needed time, and a man who needed someone capable of understanding the difference between quiet and empty. She had not known any of that, but she had been exactly the right person for all of it. And Montana, which is a place that has long experience sorting out who belongs in it, had known it before she did.